Welcome to Instant Deck Techs. The aim of this series is to give you a short, concise guide on how to build a certain deck. It won't cover every card, but we'll go through all the categories and go over the types of cards needed to make the deck work. Any card mentioned will be down in the description below. The commander of this deck is Lynde, Cheerful Tormentor. She is 1 blue, black red for a 2/4 legendary creature, human warlock with Death Touch. She has, whenever a curse is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return it to the battlefield attached to you at the beginning of your next end step. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may attach a curse attached to you to one of your opponents. If you do, draw 2 cards. This is definitely one to avoid playing over webcam, as it's going to be a cursed tribal deck. If there's an effect we want, and it's on a curse, then we'll be playing it. So do keep an eye out for them in all the sections of the deck tech. We'll be playing some sack effects, so we can cash in some of our curses, so we can get the card draw off of Lynde. As the vast majority of the curses are enchantments, there will also be a slight enchantment sub-theme as well, along with the general feeling of playing with our opponent's stuff. Let's start off with our card draw. We'll get value off of Lynde, which we'll get onto a bit later, but the first place to start is with some curses that can get us some card advantage or some filtering. These 4 here are a good place to start, with Curse of Verbosity and Curse of Surveillance adding some nice politicking to the mix. Another card that's good for those that want to plot and scheme is Karazikar the Eye Tyrant. Adding Go to the mix is really sweet, and its bottom ability, netting you a card whenever an opponent attacks another player, is a really nice effect that draws the gaze away from what you're doing. There isn't a good way to segue from being sneaky and moving your opponent's gaze into continually asking the board if they're paying the 1 with a Rhystic Study, but it and Phyrexian Arena are really solid bits of card draw on enchantments, so should be considered due to the synergy with some of the other cards in our deck. And then, as we're in Grixis, we have plenty more instance and sorcery speed bits of card draw to choose from, which you can fill up the rest of the deck with and pad out any sections of the curve that you might need. One thing that will become clear as we go through the deck is that some of the curses can be very expensive, meaning that we're going to want a bit more ramp than normal. First up is Curse of Opulence, as it's a curse that ramps us ahead, while incentivizing our opponents to fight amongst themselves. It's perfect for what the deck is trying to do. The next section is Mana Rocks. We don't have green, so this is where we want our ramp to be coming from. I put a solid selection on screen here, but there are also things like the talismans to consider as well. Basically try to have it tap for a colour of mana and keep it costing less than 3 and you should be good. What Grixis lacks in ramp, it makes up for in death, so for our interaction section we should have a good selection to choose from. Curse of Death's Hand, Forgeborn Oreads, and Doomwake Giant will make mincemeat out of any token players on the table, with the Giant scaling pretty impressively late game if we're able to double or triple spell some cheap curses out in a turn. Another great bit of removal is Imprisoned in the Moon, and it being one of the few proper answers to a commander makes it a great card to consider. And then as we've mentioned, there's plenty of ways to kill things in these colours, so run the best ones that you have available to you. Try and match them up with what you think your playgroup will be playing, but generally speaking, keep it cheap, and where possible, keep it instant, only really going sorcery speed for things like board wipes. Moving over to our protection, we'll actually need quite a lot of it in this deck. We'll need to keep Lynde around, as we don't really want any curses to remain stuck to us, so we can't have her dying. Swift Boots and Lightning Greaves will obviously be a good way of stopping any targeted removal. If we do end up with a curse on us, something like Harmless Offering can be used to move it back to an opponent. Then there are also cards like Propaganda to consider, which do a great job of protecting our life total. As a large portion of our deck is curses, we won't actually have that many blockers. Another card that works really well when there isn't too much of a board state is Portcullis. This stops any more creatures entering the battlefield, so the plan is to get Lynde out, drop this, and then we'll have a great time while our curses drain out our opponents. We can also protect the curses a little by making them harder to target, with Caliphate. Even if it just delays removal a couple of turns, that will still hopefully mean our curses trigger a couple of extra times that we wouldn't have otherwise got. As we're not in white, we don't have access to any of the replenish effects to get all of our enchantments back in one go. One card we do have is Crystal Chimes, a fair and pretty good late game card that can return all of our curses from our graveyard back to our hand. And if it's out early, we'll make our opponents wonder if it's worth targeting our enchantments at all. Okay, let's move on to our Curse Matters cards. These are all ways of getting the most out of them. First up is cards that let us copy our curses. Getting multiple effects of some of our cheaper ramp or card draw curses early will be helpful at moving us forward, but then late game, copying some of our game-winning curses will be backbreaking for our opponents. A great way to get the best curses out of our deck, and definitely something I'd want to be copying, is with Curse of Misfortunes. If you ramp this into one of our big curses we'll get to later, it can be game over for an opponent very quickly. In a similar vein, a card that was born to block is Bitterheart Witch. Who in their right mind would want to attack you with this out, as they know they're going to get cursed straight away afterwards? Some of the cards that do good work in this deck are cards that give us an extra upkeep. A lot of the curses do trigger on upkeep, so these will double up those effects. When you put the deck together, see how many curses you're running that mention upkeep. The more you have, the better these will be. We've mentioned already, some of our curses can be pretty high in mana value. To help with that, we can run some cards that make our spells, or specifically our enchantments, cheaper to cast. These don't count towards our ramp, as our ramp is needed to play these spells as well as everything else in the deck. These can be run in addition to them. Last up in this section is ways of sacking our curses. This will let us use Lynde's first and second ability, and start the train rolling so we can move our enchantments around, and importantly, draw some extra cards. With these effects, you want them to be at instant speed. The best time to sack a curse is on the player before your turn's second main phase, specifically before they go to their end step. That way the curse will only be on us for the shortest amount of time, and will mean Lynde will dodge most of the removal possible. Let's move over to some ways of winning the game, and we have a good selection of powerful effects to go over. First up is our game-winning curses. On screen here we have a bunch of curses that either drain or ping our opponents, making sure their life totals are always heading in a downward direction. In a similar vein, Grim Guardian will trigger whenever a curse or another enchantment comes into play, again lowering our opponent's life totals. A more classic way of lowering some life totals is generating a bunch of tokens and turning them sideways. These curses will help us gum up the board so we can attack, and some of them will mean we can block as well. On the topic of gumming up the board, Saheeli and more importantly Shark Typhoon will trigger off of our enchantments as well, so definitely something to consider. And then finishing up with some of the cooler curses, we have Curse of Vengeance for when you really need to send a message, Curse of Echoes for when you want a bit of shenanigans, Curse of Bloodletting for when you need to ramp up the damage, and then Cruel Reality for when you need to banish a player to the Shadow Realm. Rounding off the deck with some utility lands, being 3 colours means we won't want to run too many. Some I like are Reliquary Tower in case we really start popping off, Maze of Ith to blank a big attacker, and then Bog to answer any graveyard decks at the table. You can also look at the cycling lands as a bonus way of smoothing out your draws. The rest of your mana base will be very dependent on what you have available to you. We've recently released a video with some advice on building a deck with a budget mana base, which might be of help. Until next time, please like, share and subscribe, and let us know down in the comments if there are any commanders you'd like to see a deck tech on. Thank you very much for watching.